Okay, go for it.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Oh, Adam, you just make me a
Oh,
host real
right.
quick. That would be
Yep.
great. Um, Happy Tuesday. Hopefully you guys have had a nice week so far. Staying cool for those of you down in Front Range where I've heard it's hot. Um, so it seems like we've got a smaller group to start today, so hopefully we get a couple more board members joining us. But the purpose of today's meeting is to give you guys some space together, some time together to debrief the public comments that we received at our last meeting. And we know that there were only a couple speakers, but we did get some really nice responses through our interactive polling. And then in addition, we've got the public comment forum open online and the code proposal forum open online. So amongst all of that, I think we've got some good things to start talking about and working through as a board. And so that's going to be the focus of our time together today. So our agenda is pretty straightforward. We'll start with approving meeting minutes from meeting number 7. And then I'll do just a really brief summary of some of the public comments that we heard at meeting number 7, as well as like a quick summary on what we've received to date through the code proposal forms and the public comment forms that are open on CEO's website. And then basically the rest of the time will be oriented towards board discussion. So our team has taken a couple of key themes that we heard through the public engagement meeting last time and developed a couple key questions to get the board kind of discussing these sort of 3 to 4 key themes. So we've got discussion questions to help talk about process, work through some of those themes, and then we've saved some time at the end in case any of the items that we've brought up are not, if you guys want to add anything, any other topics to discuss with the board that our team didn't pull in. So that'll be the bulk of our meeting. If we need the whole time, we'll take the whole time. If we get crickets, then maybe we'll feel like we can wrap up. But I think there'll be a lot of good stuff to talk about. And then at the end, we'll wrap up and talk about next steps. And we'll share with you guys a little bit of a just an overview of the survey that we sent out to you all last night, what it entails, what it includes, and I'll show you guys how to make sure you can save your progress as you work through it. So that's where we're headed. Any questions? Sound good? Cool. All right, so our objectives to give you all an update on or just a reminder of what we heard at our last meeting, and then to give you guys that time and space to process it as a board together. And then again, at the end of the meeting, we'll show you how we're planning to use that survey to set up the discussion agendas for our future meetings when we're really deep diving into code. All right, so we'll start as we always do with approval of the meeting minutes. And so I'll just wait to see if there's a board member who'd like to motion to approve meeting 7's meeting minutes.
Thanks for preparing those. I move to approve as presented.
Thank you,
I'll
Kevin.
motion a second.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, all in favor of approving meeting 7 meeting minutes, please say aye.
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 Kristen, I see your hand. Thank you. Any opposed, please say aye. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Meeting 7 minutes will be approved, and we'll get those posted on CEO's website shortly. All right, so now we're going to roll into just a quick summary of public comment. Again, you all received from our team a summary document of where we tried to kind of take all of the comments we received at the last meeting and organize them under themes and sort of topic areas. So if you guys have that document and you want to open it to follow along or just to use as part of our discussion today, we encourage that you do so. So there were sort of 4 primary topics that our team synthesized out of the comments that we received at the last meeting. Those were topics related to HVAC efficiency and code debiasing, regional applicability, affordability, and then health and equity. And so these are the 4 topics that we want to note. These are the ones that we've allocated time and set up discussion questions for the board today to discuss together. And anything outside of these 4 elements that you guys want to discuss, I'll ask a question once we get through the public comment summary. If there's anything else you guys want to save time for in the discussion today, and we definitely have time to do so. So on the topic of HVAC efficiency and code debiasing, there were a couple different subtopics. So starting first with the code debiasing suggestion, we heard from a couple of the folks who gave verbal public comment, that the code is inherently biased against high efficiency electric equipment. And through those comments, there were a couple of recommendations for how the board could consider debiasing the code. Those suggestions included setting site energy use targets that unbias the fuel choice. So no matter if you're a mixed fuel building or an all electric building, you have to hit the same target. Setting equal baselines and efficiency targets for all buildings, regardless of fuel type. So again, same theme. And then I guess sort of just like a general note that heat pumps and heat pump water heaters are not appropriately credited for their lower site energy use within the code, sort of leading to that inherent code bias that was shared by a couple of the folks giving public comment. So other comments related in the HVAC space to efficiency. And so in our Menti responses, which were those interactive polls we did, a top priority for folks who completed the question around what would you want to upgrade in your home if you had the opportunity, was to move to all electric HVAC appliances and allow some pathways for non-electric equipment. And then it was also indicated in that polling that heating and cooling systems were top priority to reduce carbon emissions. And then finally, in this HVAC sort of fuel choice space, we also had a couple of comments that emphasized the importance of fuel choice. So two different folks shared that there should be paths for both electrification and dual fuel systems, and that mixed fuel buildings should not be penalized as they still have many benefits. All right, moving on to the topic area of regional applicability. So these comments were really in the theme of encouraging the board to consider the diversity of community types, size, location, infrastructure capacity, all of that good stuff as it relates to this code and enforcement of this code across the state. So a couple of themes that we pulled out, that the cost of electrical infrastructure or equipment that might be required by code could be burdensome in rural areas. And there was a Menti response suggesting that the state could support with funding for any provisions that require infrastructure and more expensive equipment. There was a suggestion to consider varying rules on home sizes to help with affordability, particularly between the urban resort and rural communities in the state. And then just some emphasis on avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach for code requirements. Moving on to the topic of affordability. These comments came through a little bit in the verbal comment, but a lot in the interactive polling that we did. So some suggestions, I won't read all of these, to improve affordability as we consider the code, reducing site energy use to lower energy bills, including flexible options, avoiding adopting appendices, which might drive up cost, examining total cost of ownership, and front-end short-term and long-term affordability. There were also some comments on how to improve affordability that don't really relate to the code in our process here. Those could be things like reducing permit fees, providing tax credits, rebates, or incentives. And so we just included those to the effect that there might be opportunities to improve affordability of homes in the state that may not be directly related to this code. And then there were some concerns and unintended consequences that folks asked the Energy Code Board to consider, such as higher energy bills, high-tech solutions, rising gas rates, and thinking through if we add any cost to new buildings, making sure that it provides a benefit to that building. And then sort of our last key topic area that we wanted to highlight today is the health and equity space. So in the Menti question where we asked folks how would they want to upgrade their home if they could do it, if they could update their home to be whatever they wanted it to be. We had 9% of folks indicate that better ventilation and cleaner indoor air were high priorities. We heard from folks that they want us to prioritize healthy buildings, reducing indoor air emissions, and educating around long-term wellness implications of the code. The code can help promote health and equity through considering things like social cost of carbon when we're looking at cost calculations. And then some unintended consequences that the folks asked the board to consider are avoiding low quality housing, building to support folks with asthma, avoiding profits over people, and requirements that might hurt the building industry, and anything that could produce housing inequalities. And then we just pulled out this comment here for the bottom of on the bottom of the slide. The most populous areas in the state are in severe non-attainment. And so housing and buildings should be built to a standard that will help preserve quality of life in those zones. Okay, so that's a sort of a quick hit summary of a couple of the key themes that we heard at the last meeting. And again, hopefully you guys had a chance to read the public comment summary and process all of this, all of these great notes. There were a couple of other pieces within that public comment summary that we that were a little bit shorter with a little bit less comment related to them, but they fell in these different areas, making sure that the code is supporting resilience, workforce, that it's enforceable and doesn't add too much burden for folks enforcing the code, a focus on building envelope, and some comments around renewable energy. So hopefully, again, you guys took a look, and if you hadn't had a chance to review the additional comments in these topics, feel free to open that public comment summary, and there's a couple bullets for each of these you can find in there. And then I'll just kind of go through the themes that we've also seen from the open online public comment form, as well as the code proposal form. So there's about 4 or 5 comments in each, and we sent these out ahead of time, but if the board hasn't had a chance to look through these, we highly encourage you guys to do so. On the public comment side, we saw a comment around solar panels and snow shed, and making sure that there's like safety considerations in where we're putting the solar ready zones. Requiring electric service for residential and the electric ready standard, ensuring that there's AFCI breakers when panels are upgraded. There was a comment that the construction industry, according to this person who submitted the comment, is ready for these low carbon codes, especially across the Front Range. And then there was a comment generally in support of the EV code requirements. On the code proposal side, some of these actually looked like code proposals, some looked more just like other public comment. But there was a code proposal for section R402.1.2.1 for indirectly conditioned attics. There was a code proposal that we consider, again, some of these public comments tied to the code proposals. You'll see that as a theme, that making sure when we're thinking about the solar ready zone that those solar panels can't shed snow into sidewalks that might create a safety hazard. The code language was submitted for how we include the electrical service requirement in the residential electric ready standard. And then there was again another nod to AFCI breakers in the code proposal form. So lots of good insight that we've received to date. And I think some really good themes and things that we can talk about today as a group. So I want to just pause here and I'll let you guys read these questions quickly, and then I'll stop sharing and we can kind of open it up for discussion. So before we dive into today's discussion, to make sure we save space for anything that you guys want to talk about, we want to know, is there any of the topics that we mentioned so far that you feel particularly strong about that we want to focus our discussion on today? And then are there any topics that we did not share that that you've identified through listening or reading the public comments that you would like to add to our discussion today? Yeah, we'll start with Ron and then we'll go to Tim.
The fuel bias, I think that's a topic that really should be talked about. I know that our code will have to allow for all fuels, but I think I just want to see what we can do to explore that topic a little further.
Awesome, thanks, Ron, and that's great. That'll be the first, I think, big topic we jump into today. Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, all. I think the priority in my mind is discussing the affordability components of anything that this board is looking to do. I think that's one of the big charges in the state legislation in regards to the costs. I know there's lots of discussion whether it's upfront costs versus the long-range costs, but the costs are still the costs. And I think that that's really important as we move down the path. And I'm kind of curious when we get to that debiasing thing to see if those folks had tried taking that through the 2024 IECC standard code change process, but I'll ask that question when we dive into that. Thanks.
Sounds great. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Kristen.
Hi, thanks. To question number 2, there was one comment in the public comment about refrigerant transition. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about that, but it happens to be an area of expertise, so I could give a quick overview of some of my thoughts. It's internationally and federally driven, so there's not much that we can do about that, but I think it does come into play when we discuss the other item, which is fuel debiasing and looking holistically at carbon intensities and carbon footprint. And then the other item, to question number 1, so many of the comments talked about the primacy and the importance of healthier homes and indoor air quality, and making sure that these efficient, low carbon, cost effective homes are also better homes. That I think it warrants a little bit of discussion. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. That sounds great. All right. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Rob.
Yeah. So I know, and if I'm skipping ahead, we can put a pin in it. On fuel debiasing, is there any in the existing model code or any of the appendices, is there any reference to an EUI? Because we're restricted to what's in the model code and appendices. If there's nothing in there on EUI, we might be a little bit between a rock and hard place and whether we can utilize.
Carolyn, did you raise your hand to respond to Rob's comment? Okay. I don't believe there are site EUI targets within the codes, and Adam, I'll let you jump in and correct.
The only thing I think, Rob, is potentially in the commercial net zero energy appendix. There are site EUI targets for commercial, and then obviously residential is ERI based. But I think so. It's possible that there could be a way to modify some of the site EUI targets and weaken the net zero code appendix to use some of those site EUI targets without requiring the on-site renewables offsets or something to that nature. So I could think of some way of doing that. And then I think some of the other ways that had been mentioned by public commenters was also using some of the additional efficiency credits to try to create more of a balance between, essentially, if they think that there is reduced benefit for all electric heat pumps, then you could require more, or you could allow more points to count for going to higher efficiency electric heat pumps, something to that nature. So I think that is both. Those were kind of the two main pathways that had been proposed. And I do think there are appendices that could potentially be used to go either of those directions if the board wants to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam.
Can we pull from other codes for that? Like the IGCC?
Not the way the statute is written, no.
Awesome. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, Carolyn, I'll go to you.
Yeah, unrelated to this particular discussion, I just wanted to touch on the couple of comments that were related to breakers and panel upgrades associated. And I just wanted to clarify that stems from the National Electric Code and what's been adopted as opposed to the energy code. So I appreciate the comments that were raised, but just noting that we don't have purview over what goes into the state adoption of the electric code.
Thank you for that, Carolyn. Appreciate that background. Yeah, Kevin.
A quick question, kind of what can we evaluate by statute? Maybe a question for David or Adam. When we talk about costs, do we have any statute allowed way to consider the cost of not doing what we need to do? Like, we can't afford to keep doing things the way we can, but I'm not sure of the statute language in terms of how do we look at affordability when you consider the cost impact of not doing enough with this code, whether that's, embodied carbon, operational carbon, or human health.
Yeah, David, I can take a stab at answering some of that, and maybe you can follow up if there's anything else. But Kevin, I think the statute is very vague about what affordability means, about what costs are taken into account here. And so I think a lot of that is very up to this board to determine what costs need to be factored in. I think we've heard that upfront costs are absolutely a factor, a cost that need to be factored in. Life cycle costs of the building need to be factored in. We've also heard a lot of public comments that say social cost of carbon, cost of inaction on climate, cost of, a lot of these other social and health factors also need to be taken into account. And unless David has any other thoughts on this, I would say that the statute kind of allows us to consider all of that. There's no limitations there.
That's my read on it too.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Adam and David. Andrew.
Following up from Tim previously, I at some point suggested, which I wish to restate, consistent with what the ICC must undertake with respect to the energy codes, they're obligated to identify the code change proposal estimated immediate cost impact and not just the estimated life cycle cost impact. And there's a lot of emphasis on the life cycle cost, and I don't think either can be wholly distinguished from the other. I believe they both need to be considered, and particularly with affordability, the initial or immediate estimated cost should be taken into account in each proposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. You cut out just slightly right at the end of your comment there, so I wanted to make sure you sounded like you were going that upfront and ongoing costs both need to be considered as we look through proposals.
Can you hear me? I was trying to at least restate what I believe to be reasonable interpretation of the ICC's intent is to identify the immediate cost impact and the estimated life cycle cost impact. And one may not be able to wholly separate one from the other, but to overly focus on the life cycle and not adequately consider the immediate cost impact, I think would be inconsistent with the intent of the board.
Thank you, Andrew. That one came through clear. Appreciate it. Okay. So just repeating what I heard from folks, we want to definitely talk about the fuel debiasing proposal, affordability, health and indoor air quality, and sort of within the affordability and health indoor air quality conversation, make sure we're talking about cost. And then within, perhaps it's its own section at the end, Kristen, or within the fuel debiasing, we want to maybe just touch on and inform the board what's going on with the refrigerant transition. Carolyn.
Yeah, just one more thing to add. I know we certainly heard with a few folks speak to the one size fits all concern. And just, I think that a lot of that is manageable in terms of what we move into the base code versus what we put into optional appendices. So balancing what should be, a statewide minimum, that's the appropriate base code should all be in the base code. And then where we envision municipalities and jurisdictions likely to want to move beyond, making sure that we have robust content in the optional appendices. So I just want to acknowledge that we did hear that from folks, and there's a lot to be very cognizant about that in terms of, things like solar in particular, where we have, very different contexts for customers served by investor-owned utilities versus co-ops versus municipal utilities. So just want to say that we certainly heard that, and I think we can manage it. Just wanted to make that comment.
Thanks, Carolyn. And that was one that we had flagged for discussion today. So we can pull up those discussion questions when we get there as well and see if the board wants to dive deeper into that that topic as we move through today. Okay, anything else from the board that you guys heard, want to talk about before we dive into our discussion? Rob.
Sorry. To continue on this path. One thing that I've, having designed new construction rebate programs for a number of years now, is that, to Andrew's point, to be concerned about first cost. We found it's probably worth noting, we found that finding reliable first cost data is really challenging, especially in res. And so just I mean, I don't know what to do about it, but it's something to take note of, that we would have to find we'd have to find a way to get relatively reliable first cost data in new construction for some of these measures. Because like I said, I mean, we've our entire rebate program is driven by incremental costs, and we have a really hard time finding what we would consider reliable incremental cost data for new construction.
Thanks, Rob. And I think that challenge is well heard and well seen across the state. Yeah, Kevin.
Two quick things. I'm not sure what'll fit in here, but in the spirit, two things about the spirit of right sizing and not having a one size fits all approaches in the code. There's a lot of resonance around the size of home for the residential side, that 5,000 square foot threshold. Two questions. Well, one, I'd like to have us have that in the conversation. Two, I wonder if there's flexibility in what that threshold is. And then the second thing is maybe another Adam and David question in terms of complexity or what's allowed in the statute, again, in the spirit of right sizing for a code that serves the whole state and all the climate zones. Are there any exceptions we can make on a per climate zone basis that would take some of those things that would otherwise raise the bar for Front Range and not penalize mountain or resort communities?
I would say yes, Kevin, because I think that would be weakening of the requirements, right? If you have a certain requirement for Front Range and you have less requirements for somewhere else or for a different climate zone or whatever, then that would be a weaker requirement. And so I would say generally, yes, that would be allowable. And I mean, I think the IECC already does that a lot with, the breakdown of, different points and different requirements for different climate zones. And so I think that that's something that the board could consider reasonably, so long as you're not trying to make stronger requirements than what the code is, unless it's through an appendix or some other form, but not just outright strengthening requirements.
Thanks, Adam. All right, last call for thoughts from the board. Yeah, Will.
So I'm also very interested in this conversation about the potential for tiering the requirements by house size. So essentially adopting a set of requirements and then looking at weakening them for, in my mind, it's essentially for starter homes and, potentially for sort of the equivalent of starter homes in the multifamily space. So it would be interesting if we were able to do some analysis to kind of determine what that square footage, what a rational square footage would be to think about different tiers for, again, starter homes versus other homes.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Phil. Yeah, I just jumped ahead to that slide and added a bullet to make sure we talk about the home size component of that regional variability. Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I'm in support of that concept of on single family size thresholds, but I would want to make sure that we keep in mind on the multifamily side, we're seeing a lot of push for the affordable housing. Actually, in Broomfield, we call it attainable housing now, and how the costs are going to affect that, kind of breaking that up between the multifamily and just the other types of commercial, because I think it's really critical that the board pay attention to that. A lot of jurisdictions really going down the path to require most or all multifamily to have some component of attainable housing. I know in Broomfield we have that huge push, which is a good push. So I just wanted to point that out to keep the board, as we go through the discussions on that, is not just the single family size threshold, but somehow incorporate something similar. And I don't know how you do that for multifamily. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and just jump into the first session for our discussion today, which is just by way of how we organize these slides, we'll start with the conversation around debiasing of the code. And to make sure we save time for this session and the next couple that we want to make sure we save time to talk about, we'll aim for around 20 minutes per discussion with the board before we move along to the next topic area. So just keeping that in mind as we go through. So I'll read these questions and then we'll go ahead and drop these questions in the and then we can kind of share, look at each other and have a discussion. So again, just a note that in public comment, we heard that the code is biased against all electric equipment. So my first question on this slide here is there an interest from the board in discussing this? If so, how can we make, and it sounds like there is. So if so, how can we make the code unbiased based on fuel type? How might this interact with initial thoughts around an electric preferred approach? Are there communities in or outside of Colorado that have attempted this in their codes? What might be some code benefits or unintended consequences of leveling this playing field? And which sections of the code do you think will be the most effective in addressing this? So just some things to kind of spur the conversation and get us going today. I'll stop sharing and drop these questions in the chat, and I'll go ahead and pass it to Carolyn.
Tim beat me. I thought. Did you take your hand down and then put it back up, Tim?
No, I'll go second. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks. I was like, wait a minute. Tim was on this side, and then I went over to the code. So one of the things. So yes, obviously, I think we need to strive to debias fuel choices as much as we can to be consistent with our overall objective. So I think the clear answer is yes. I think the strategies may be different in between commercial and residential, given what's available to us in the code. So I do recommend as we dive into that, maybe being explicit which one we're referring to. On the commercial section, I wanted to throw out section 407 as an example, which is using the site energy use rather than energy cost metric. And so we can require the energy use metric for the modeling as opposed to energy cost metric, which I think goes a long ways towards addressing one of the core biases, which is around the cost assumptions that are used.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. Over to Tim now.
Thanks. So I'll ask my question again that I brought up just a little bit ago. If the group, whether it was RMI or anybody else, had attempted to take this approach through the IECC change process, through the standards for that 18-month ongoing 2024, does anybody know that?
I do not, Tim, and we don't have Hope or Anna today, but
Yep.
We'd be happy to follow up on that question.
The reason I ask is that's a kind of just like that iCode process that we've been involved with the other codes outside of the IECC. It's an international consensus process, and that's really the avenue for a lot of these code changes. That's where things should be taken through with all the experts throughout the country and the world. Notwithstanding, we don't have a lot of experts sitting on this board, but doing it site specific, so to speak, for Colorado. But I was just curious if they attempted that and didn't get any traction, but apparently they didn't because it's not in the 24, or if they just didn't do it and this concept came up later and where RMI is looking to try to take that through us. Thanks.
Yeah, and Tim, I would say I think RMI specifically, who is the one who proposed it, but there are others who have mentioned it in the public comments as well, have considered proposals. I don't know what was submitted in terms of the IECC process. We can certainly ask them that, or whether they did, or if someone else did. They may not have submitted it, but someone else might have submitted something like this. So we can certainly try to dig in more into that and reach out to some of our ICC contacts as well to see if they're aware of any proposals that were made on that. Because one of the benefits of those proposals too is in a lot of cases it has a lot more explanation, a lot more data or analysis that's been done that we could certainly leverage. So we can certainly look to find if any of that exists.
Thanks, Adam. Good question, Tim. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on some of the energy performance metrics or performance path metrics in general. Yeah, and Carolyn, I agree 100%. The having things be cost related, any cost related metric is it's always challenging because a building that complies in one place won't necessarily comply in another place, or would be considered differently even if the energy performance of the building is exactly the same. There is in the 2024 IECC C407, there is an option to use source energy metrics. But that's honestly not any better than costs. It's at least normalized, but the source energy does not incentivize electrification in any way. It actually penalizes it still. It's not as bad as it used to be, but the conversion factors are still definitely weighting things, WEI, GHT weighting things towards gas, which is not great. It's not really great for anybody. And there are no options in either the 2024 IECC or any of the ASHRAE performance options, and we have two over there also. None of them use site energy. Not one. Whereas we do have at least a couple of jurisdictions who are moving to a site energy performance metric, or at least having an option for one. In Boulder, we have a performance target pathway. Louisville is also exploring that, and Denver, of course, has their appendix SE, which is site energy compliance. A fun fact for you since Denver adopted the 2022 Denver Energy Code, I'm an energy modeler, so I'm a little biased here, but every project that we have documented in Denver, and we've done a couple dozen now, has used the site energy compliance path. And that's really fun for an energy person because we really get to talk about energy savings, not energy costs, not source energy. But it looks at everything on an equal playing field as far as just actual energy use. And right now we don't have that option in any of these other codes. So I think that would be something to consider and discuss.
And
thank you.
One thing I will note too is that actually in the 2024 ICC in the residential performance path, they did add a site energy allowance equivalent, but they did not maintain that in the commercial side. So it's kind of an interesting thing that's in there.
Right.
R405.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, Adam. I was
Yeah.
speaking commercial, but you're right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks, Adam, for adding that little piece. Carolyn, I'll pass it to you, and I'll also flag that Kevin asked you a question in the chat. So if you want to respond to that while you've got the floor, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I have to think about Kevin's question, but certainly, we've been on a EUI pathway in Boulder since 2020, so have a lot of experience in how that works, and certainly it's a pathway that I think is very positively received in the building community because it doesn't require you to model a baseline, to go through, like, the modeling simplified. You just need to model what you're building, as opposed to going through all of the detailed comparison. So I think two things I wanted to say is, as you're talking, Kim, to our code team, I did note that, like, all the EUI sections in the commercial code were crossed out, so struck from the version that you gave us in the draft, and so there's something around that. And then I just want to zero down on, I think this is maybe a question for David and Adam to take offline and ponder. I mean, this discussion with site EUI, source EUI, source site energy, source energy, EUI pathways. none of what we're talking about is intended to make anything more stringent. And so I think if we were to impose, in my opinion, something like a site EUI metric in the commercial, even though it's not present, as long as we demonstrate it's not more stringent than what the base code says, I think we're staying true to that, especially since this is a mod, it's pointing to the metric we want used for the calculation, as opposed to trying to drive for greater efficiency or different outcomes. So I think maybe that's something to ponder a little bit.
Yeah, and I would say initial reaction to that, Carolyn, is you're right. I think to Elizabeth's point, that was very well taken about with energy cost, it's really hard to determine what is more stringent and what is not, because energy cost is not an equivalent metric everywhere. And so like it's hard, if you essentially you're taking a metric that is not something that has a standard, and then you're taking it to something that does have a standard, I think we'd have to ponder a little bit about, justification for that. But I think the overall point you made is right, that like if we can demonstrate it's essentially effectively equivalent, then it's not strengthening per se, as long as, but I think we'd have to dive into more of what that looks like.
I agree with Adam, and I was just going to add my standard caveat, which is I'd like to be able to answer anything on a case-by-case basis rather than try to give some global response.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, David.
Yeah, and specifically the base code is technically designed to create that equivalency. So I think as long as we stay true to that.
Yeah, well, and I think one argument, Carolyn, is that they clearly thought within residential that a site EUI or a source EUI approach was an equivalent allowable consideration instead of energy cost. And so I feel like there's some justification that as long as you do it in the right way, that the same could be held true for commercial. So I think it just was the devil's in the details of like, what exactly does that look like? But on a high level, I think I think you're right about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, guys. Yeah, Kristen, go to you.
Hi. So I love the fact that we're discussing site versus source EUI, and the old adage goes, you don't want to assume or you make an ass of yourself. So I think we're making a lot of assumptions here that both our audience and every single code board member here understands the nuances of site versus source EUI, or even energy use intensity. So I thought maybe it'd be very useful to do a quick level set, and I wanted to invite Elizabeth to talk a little bit about the nuance between site and source. My experience too is I've come away with a more favorable impression for site energy, and this is after many years of working at DOE and using source EUI, energy use intensity. And I wanted to explain the reason why site EUI or site energy intensity takes into account, the energy that's actually being used within the building itself, versus source, which a source EUI, a source energy use intensity, which is an expression of the energy usually expressed in terms of per square foot that a building is using, attempts to go one level up and say, okay, well, let's look at the actual energy intensity of the sources of energy that are supplying that building, and take into account things like line losses or the generation efficiency. And from a national perspective, a lot of that attempt to go back to the source uses some standardized estimates that may not take into account the differences in energy transition among states. And they also tend to be backwards looking, not necessarily forwards looking. So we know here in Colorado, for instance, that we have legislation driving a really robust energy transition in our electricity sector. Essentially, our source energy is getting cleaner and cleaner, but that may not necessarily be reflected in these standardized metrics at the time. So when Elizabeth says things like historically using source energy has biased building standards in favor of gas, well, that was true because there was a smaller difference between the site and source energy intensity of using gas versus the site and source energy of using electricity, which historically had a lot of, coal and gas in it. And so when you converted from a site to a source, EUI, energy use intensity, you had to penalize electric buildings more, whereas you don't necessarily get that with the site calculation. I would invite those experts in the site and source EUI to weigh in and add a little more color or correct wherever you think I may have gotten it wrong. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. That was really helpful for me, and I'm sure others on the board, so I appreciate you taking a moment to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to those two terms. Elizabeth, move to you.
Yeah, I thought that was terrific, Kristen. Thank you. I don't really have a lot of color to add because I think you nailed it. It is, I think that's the way you described it is perfect. The source energy is very much more looking backwards, and where site energy is more looking forwards, at least for us. That may not be true for all areas, but like you said, Colorado is definitely looking forward to a cleaner grid. And the source energy metrics that we would be required to use, or that are defined in the latest version of the IECC, aren't really reflective of that. I have colleagues of mine who are much more well versed in this topic and can get really passionate about these numbers and where they come from. They are, source energy metrics are really complicated, which Kristen, you alluded to. And I wouldn't even venture to guess on the complexity of developing those. But it is just because it's a changing number as well, such that a building that would be maybe not compliant today, or would be compliant today, would not be compliant in the future, or vice versa. And I don't love codes that are time dependent. I mean, that also is just very, same thing with cost, right? The bias now is very difficult to nail down. And kind of to that point, the reason I raised my hand again, and Adam and David, you kind of answered this for me a little bit, but I'd love to just maybe talk about this a little bit more, is, when we say we're not allowed to make the code more stringent, how we're actually defining stringency. And David, you said, that may be on a case-by-case basis, which I actually really like, because that, I think, opens the door to some potential where, if we're trying to remove bias, like, is that making things more stringent or not? Well, it depends on what metrics we use. If it's, by stringency, if we say, overall site energy, is it energy cost? Is it source energy? Is it first cost? What those different metrics are, what building designers and developers experience, what is their definition of stringency? Do we have any kind of is that defined in our legislation, what stringency means?
It's not.
Okay, well, I think that's kind of a good thing.
Yeah. I think it's probably good in that it gives you all a little flexibility.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good to know. Thanks. That kind of helps me think about things. If we were to propose something to that, maybe results in an improvement in one area, is could still be considered, maybe less stringent because it maybe allows for more flexibility or something like that. Great. That gives me some things to chew on. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great question. Don.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to give Kristen kudos on that explanation. I've tried to explain this many times, and I did not do it near as eloquently as she did. But the quick point to that is this is going to be our biggest challenge with a one-size-fits-all approach. One-size-fits-all is not going to work in the state of Colorado, and we have got to make sure we maintain flexibility. And I think that was just proved the point there with that explanation. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Appreciate that comment. Okay, so thanks all for kind of answering those initial questions and sharing initial reactions. Dialing back into some of the discussion questions we have, because we've got about a few minutes left to cover this topic. I'd love to sit on the questions maybe 3 and 4 for a little bit. What might be some co-benefits or unintended consequences of leveling that playing field of considering a debias approach? And this has been alluded to a little bit, but what sections of code do you think would be most effective in addressing this? I know Carolyn and Elizabeth brought up section C407 and R405 already seems like it has the site EUA pathway on the residential side. Are there other sections we would want to consider or think through if we're, again, in the debiasing framework, if we were to move that forward?
Did we talk about the credits? I have my code up, but I haven't dug through which the right numbers are. But I think that was one of the suggestions as well, is adjusting credits.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the point, Kim, is that like
requirements,
part of it,
which I think
and to Carolyn's point, what you were saying, like there's multiple pathways in the code, right? And so I think if you're going to debias, it's like you can't just debias the performance path. You have to debias the prescriptive path as well, which I think, Carolyn, is what you're saying about with the credits, just to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at C406 and all of those credits. Rob.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple some unintended consequences or co-benefits, either one of them. You know, if these efforts to debias underpinning code conflicts with other codes, if it conflicts with the IBC, IRC, fuel gas code, electrical code, that I think is a potential conflict there. And I had another idea that completely took off on me, so I'll step back, and if I remember, I'll tune back in.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rob. But yeah, certainly something to consider how any changes will conflict with other codes, and we'll make sure we're vetting any and all items with our code experts as we go through. And looks like you may have remembered.
And I remembered. You know, I think the other part of it is, you know, there's a risk that some of this stuff that we might introduce might render a code that's difficult or impossible to enforce. And so I think we need to think about impact. You know, obviously, Tim's going to be able to provide a lot of feedback on this, but we got to make sure that this is an enforceable code and an actionable and enforceable code for our code officials too.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And maybe building on that, just recognizing workforce differences across the state as well, if we're moving to or workforce awareness and considerations as well. All right. Any final thoughts from the board on sort of the fuel debiasing? Yeah, Elizabeth, jump in.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you brought up about you know, the avoiding the one size fits all approach. And I wonder if it makes sense, rather than, you know, trying to exclude cost or exclude source energy, if we take one of the approaches that there is an option in ASHRAE that local jurisdictions, like if someone were to adopt ASHRAE, they can also adopt, oh gosh, what is it? It's like Appendix I or something in ASHRAE 90.1 that allows a jurisdiction to permit other metrics. And that is a spot that does allow site energy, source energy, or carbon emissions in addition to energy costs. So that's something we wouldn't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, so to say, but we could look at something like that actually opens the door to more options from a compliance metric standpoint. And I don't know, what does the board think about that? Like maybe going the other way and, you know, opening up to more things rather than closing the door to things.
I guess initial reaction, Elizabeth, on that topic is, I also think that we heard a lot about wanting to truly level the playing field for all electric. And my concern is, for example, if we know that there's inherently bias in one of those pathways, do we want to retain it? I think is something that we should really think carefully about towards the overall state interest. I haven't predetermined like my true answer, but I think that that's kind of an initial reaction, is making sure that I think we want to have as much flexibility for sure. I think if we know that there's a pathway that ends up in a result that's different than what we're charged with in terms of arriving at a near zero energy code, and we know that the outcome is potentially resulting in things being farther away from that, then I just want to just check in on that.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because it is kind of baked in, like that Appendix I is baked into the code right now, but it's like one of those things that's like when approved by the rating authority,
Right.
sort of thing. So that's there, like that exists if someone was to really go down
Right.
the rabbit hole. And now that's not going to be the typical project that's going to use, ASHRAE 2022 Appendix G for compliance. Like that's not going to happen very often. But it is something that's there that a jurisdiction could adopt right now. So,
Right.
that's something to keep in mind. But it's not part of the, base code, I should say.
Yeah, so I think that's the distinction that I support as well. And I raised my hand for a different reason, Kim, and I just wanted to say I don't feel like we talked about residential and the different nuances of residential, especially since we know that we have the same problem in the HERS ERI rating issue, and I don't know if we have as straightforward a way to debias that. So I'm curious what folks' thoughts are on that.
Yeah, thanks for that flag, Carolyn. And and maybe that was my confusion, that when Adam, you brought up R405, it sounded like there's a site pathway for compliance, and maybe I was misunderstanding that. So is that, just to double click on that really quick, is that what, Adam, can you elaborate on that? Or is that not, do we not feel like that compliance pathway meets the intention, or is one of many and the rest are still have that bias?
Well, and R405 is separate from the ERI pathway as well. So ERI is R406. So I think it's a different calculus. I think 405 is more akin to C407, and that the commercial side doesn't really have a pathway that's like the ERI, so to speak.
Right. So, okay. So yeah, recognizing there's bias in the other pathways that might still need to.
Yeah. So residential is going to have the prescriptive pathway and the ERI pathway as well, which I think we've acknowledged that all have some form of inherent bias. And similarly with commercial, that there's like the prescriptive as well as the performance, that both have their inherent biases as well. Okay.
Thanks for that clarification. Tim.
Yeah, thanks. Back to the previous, excuse me, comment on the, I thought I heard of the jurisdiction would have the choice of adopting the ASHRAE 90.1. It's my understanding the way the IECC reads is you have that choice embedded already, that if you don't do the base code, IECC code, you can go down to 90.1 with the caveat that you have to do everything under the 90.1. I know several cycles ago, you could mix and match. I think that might have been back in the 2015. And then that got changed so that you would have to go strictly down everything in a 90.1, which would include the appendices. So I don't think the board would need to do anything with the 2024 IECC. It gives you that option, the way I understand the way the code is.
Yeah, that's correct, Tim. A jurisdiction would have to explicitly exclude that compliance option, like Denver did.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Well, before we move on from this topic, Elizabeth and Carolyn just posed 2 additional questions from the board, so maybe we can just spend a moment noodling on those. Question from Carolyn: any thoughts from the board on how we might bring fuel debiasing in to the residential code? And then to Elizabeth's question, like, is there interest in just adding that that site metric as an option, keeping all of the other potentially more biased options in place? And Carolyn responded to that question, but if any other board members have thoughts. Yeah, Kristen. Kristen, you're muted.
I seem to recall that a lot of the comments about debiasing were explicit on water heating. Does that jive with other people's recollections? And if so, it does seem like the credit menu is the place to start.
Carolyn, it looked like you were, I think it was both for space and water heating, but
Water heating.
Yeah, there were separate comments around explicitly water heating. But like my understanding, and I would look to my, expert modeler fellows here, because unlike so EUI on the commercial side is very clearly a kBTU per square foot metric. ERI is not. And so it's embedded into the ERI pathway as bias for both space and water heating.
And Caroline, I think to some degree, just overall efficiency, right? I mean, I think like there was some webinar I was on related to like passive house and how passive house, like even though the EUI for passive house is like less than a quarter of what it was for a standard reference design under the IECC, that like it's only 5 points better or something on the HERS score.
Right.
And so I think just overall efficiency in addition to the equipment types and fuel types like are not necessarily factored in there.
Right. So just to offer it up, I mean, as we collectively noodle on it, like I think that's where, potentially the additional efficiency requirements can come in, and setting scores. Like, so if you're going in that pathway, layering in those score requirements in a way that tries to create that debias. It's just not as straightforward as I think what we discussed on the commercial side.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I've done I'm not an ERI modeler, but we have folks on our team who are. So this is something we're learning a lot about, and it's tricky because you can get a better ERI score with a pretty good gas home than you can with a really good electrification or electrified home. And that's challenging. Like I see some of the like residential appendices and some of the targets that are like the ERI targets that are in those, and I don't even know what we would do. Like, some of those I just don't really even see as achievable unless I went high efficiency gas, and I don't love that. And that's one of those things we can't really change the modeling methodology because it's just all baked into whatever. Sorry, it seems like a black box to me because I can't see the inner workings. But even though we're seeing bias, within the software itself, and again, I don't know what drives that. We still have the same target no matter what the fuel source is. So that becomes, kind of similar for me, like a cost metric, that it's like, is the cheaper fuel getting or the lesser source energy fuel getting benefited? I think it is. Again, I don't really know what the inner workings are there. But ERI is tricky because we have a couple of different residential appendices that we're going to be considering that use an ERI score around that. I'll also just note that, when we're talking about residential, we're following the IECC definition of residential, not what we used in our model code definition of residential. So let's call it our low rise R2, have to follow sort of the commercial requirements for our model electric ready code, even though they're under the residential requirements of the IECC. So it's almost like we've got kind of three different sort of overall reaching requirements. And the word residential is also, defined by the code. We redefined it for the model code, as you guys remember, and several jurisdictions around town have also redefined that. So that also should be something to probably consider. Like Boulder's redefined residential, Denver's redefined residential, Louisville's considering it. So even just how we define residential, I think probably wants to be a consideration.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I don't know if any folks here are ERI folks. But feel free to raise your hand if you want to open up that black box for the group. Kim, I'll pass it to you.
Yep, I was just gonna respond to that question by Elizabeth, is that it is as a HERS rater, ERI and HERS are very similar, and the scores are based on cost comparison. So it's different whether you're using propane or gas or electric.
That helps.
Yep, it's cost comparison, and I've run into that frustration many times here as we're trying to encourage electrification and use of heat pumps, and even the efficiencies of heat pumps can't always counter the cost effectiveness of natural gas right now, which is frustrating and challenging. And I just have to follow the methodology that I'm supposed to as a HERS rater, but I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but that's what it's based on.
Thanks, Kim.
There is a greenhouse gas metric now in the software I'm using. I haven't delved into what that means, but that is a possibility to look at more. It's been on my list to learn more about it. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thanks, Kim. And yeah, as if, on all your free time, you are able to look at that greenhouse gas metric and share any key learnings, that'd be really great. Rob.
Yeah, I'll get a jump start on that. I did probably a year and a half ago now, we did look at the ResNet carbon index, and at the risk of without going too deep into the rabbit hole, there were some we found some inconsistencies, or we found some issues with utilizing that based on how they, again, to belabor the point based on source carbon intensity. And so we didn't move forward with it. It would take me 15 minutes to probably unpack that all together. I don't know that we've got that time to actually do so, but I guess all I'm saying is that the carbon index isn't really a great metric for us to use either in this circumstance.
Thanks, Rob. If you've got any of that written down anywhere, we'd certainly love to share it with the board, but no pressure if it's not.
How about this? I'll say that we didn't want to write any of it down.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. Well, in order to make sure we have time to talk about our final couple of topics from public comment, I'll maybe again call for final comments from the board on this topic, and any final thoughts that you guys want to share, or questions that haven't been asked yet. Okay. I'm not hearing any. So a couple of follow-up items that I flagged that we'll try to work on this topic is checking with our technical folks on whether fuel debiasing proposals went through the ICC process, and if any got struck, if they were in there, why they got struck. Something for Adam and David to consider is our how we might leverage an EUI standard and not make the code more stringent. And then considering, and this can probably push to our residential meetings in the future, but how we want to define residential in this process, and thinking through the many different definitions and how jurisdictions are redefining that. So I think those are the big key follow-up items. And it sounds like there's sort of a focus, if we were to think about this, in looking at obviously all of the performance pathways or prescriptive pathways within residential and commercial all would need some level of adjustment in order to debias as we move through. Okay, cool. Well, thank you guys for that great discussion. Excited to see how this shows up in as we move forward with our code discussions. So the next session I wanted to move us into is affordability and equity. And so we've got 2 slides with different questions here. And again, I'll probably go through both and then put them in the chat and open it up for board discussion. So some questions on affordability and equity. How do we balance considerations for upfront costs with operational costs? What aspects of affordability do we have control over? Aspects that are external. Are there ways this code can better align with statewide or federal funding opportunities to improve access to incentives and resources? And then what other costs, quote unquote, need to be considered when we're developing this code? And a couple were mentioned earlier as we kicked off this session, things like social cost of carbon, society-wide healthcare costs, things like that. And then our second set of questions here, how can we ensure safe, healthy, and high-quality buildings, especially for low-income communities? The equity, like what are the equity concerns we've heard to date and how can we address them? We summarized a few that we had heard, but would welcome any others that you guys have heard. Indoor air quality impacts, energy equity, volatile natural gas prices, the cost of high-tech equipment, and then, of course, home affordability. So I will go ahead and copy these questions and put them in the chat and welcome any board members to start to jump in and share if you guys have any initial thoughts. And Carolyn, I'll let you kick us off.
Sure. I mean, certainly on the balancing up front versus operational costs is something that I know our code officials do all the time in terms of considering updates. And so, you know, you're really looking at the payback of things that we may or may not impose. And so I think if we identify you know, choices, we're trying to make choices between different requirements. I think that's an analysis that we would just look to get some support around is what are, and I realized that I think it was Rob's earlier point about getting consistent, accurate data is sometimes challenging. I think there's enough information out there that we can at least make a well-informed decision based on, you know, whether something's delivering the long-term savings versus the upfront cost and vice versa. So that would certainly offer that as important. And then I think similarly, as we think about what we move in from appendices and or retain or strike from base code is also the degree to which they're like the requirement is advancing the overall goals of statute in terms of emissions reduction and achieving state goals. And so, you know, I flagged this a few times. I think we need to have a hard conversation around the solar requirements within this code that I think are challenging from an affordability standpoint, particularly in certain regions of the state, and may not deliver the outcome. And so I think that's the test that we just need to apply as we get to those kind of high level topics.
Thanks, Carolyn. Don, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to put on my small county hat first. You know, we don't see the large construction. We see a lot of the smaller square foot construction. We see that first time home builder. And one of the things that always drives me nuts when we start talking upfront costs, we're never taking into consideration the amortized out amount over the life of the building. You know, we talk about how much energy can be saved, but when you start talking about the cost of equipment, you start talking about an 8% mortgage rate over 30 years, you know, that energy rate savings isn't so great when you amortize that out. So that's one of the things that I know that's never really considered, but it is an issue when we start talking about energy efficiency and upfront costs. Now to put on my my heating and cooling guy hat, indoor air quality is absolutely always an issue. And we need to be forward thinking on how we handle indoor air quality, because so many of these aspects are energy suckers. I mean, they provide fresh air to the home, they help provide, clean air, but all they do is suck energy, and they don't help out in the long run. So we need to be really mindful when we start talking about indoor air quality. So that's all I got.
Thanks, Don. And I might put you on the spot for just a moment longer and ask, similar to what Kristen did with the source site EUI, if you can maybe take a moment to do a little bit of explaining around the amortization.
Okay, so
that would be, I think, helpful for the board.
Okay, so let me take you back about 15, 20 years when geothermal was heavily pushed into the marketplace. The geothermal salesman would always sell the upfront costs versus energy efficiency, and they would not figure in that amount amortized out over a 30-year mortgage. When they figured that process in, that geothermal system was not paying for itself. That's just the way it is. On a cash purchase for a lot of the homeowners, that's great. That works perfect. But for these first-time home buyers that are just trying to get things going, knowing that they're probably going to have to refinance that house within 5 years again anyways, and add another 30 years to it, that's the challenge we have when we start figuring actual costs in this industry. And I don't know what the answer is. It's just there's some inequity out there that is never brought up. So
awesome. Thanks, Don. Appreciate you taking an extra moment to explain that.
No problem.
All right, I'll jump to Elizabeth.
Sorry, here we go. Sorry, I was gonna have kind of a similar theme there, is getting creative with the money. I think I've mentioned this in in our last sort of board code cycle. Well, let me back up. I'm always trying to find money for projects, whether it's rebates or tax credits or incentives or grants or whatever. My whole evil plan is to make the more sustainable building also the more affordable building. So to that end, I'll just remind the board that anytime we make something mandatory, we take away a utility's opportunity to rebate that thing. So the magic word in any code is optional. If you've got multiple options in C406, then the utility can look at those and say, none of those are mandatory. Sure, I can rebate that heat pump. Sure, I can rebate that other thing that saves energy, because it's optional. It's not mandatory. So it's just overall reaching, anytime we can make something optional, it does open the door to helping folks target those incentives. But even with all all the incentives and tax credits and rebates and everything that's available right now, the timing of that is still a challenge. How do we get the money to people up front when they have to buy the equipment, pay the contractor? A rebate and incentive and tax credits and whatnot don't always solve the problem because of the timing challenge. And I know now we're getting way beyond the scope of what the board can do with the energy code, but since we've got the Colorado Energy Office's ear here, we'd love to see some creativity in almost like a bridge financing, where if a project can see, hey, I can leverage this terrific rebate that the heat pump tax credit or whatever, if we can leverage that up front, that's a game changer, because like Don said, if we can borrow less money, the value of that incentive is huge because of the amortization. I know Denver is experimenting with some things with some affordable housing projects, where Denver has some specific electrification rebates for they call them equity priority buildings, and they're experimenting with some pilot projects and sort of a bridge financing kind of thing, where this sort of third party financier or whatever is giving the developer sort of a short-term loan based on the future value of these rebates. And what that means is they have more cash up front. And so they'll be able to pay off that loan basically as soon as construction is complete and they get that money in hand. And that means it doesn't have to go into their big loan. so to say. And that's a problem all the time. You know, anytime I'm trying to encourage somebody to upgrade something and I say, oh, you know, I have this rebate, I have this tax credit, and they're like, I still have to spend the money today. So, you know, something to move things into the front with that kind of stuff. And again, I know this is way outside the scope of the energy code, but if the state of Colorado can help with something like that, I'd love to see a program develop with that in mind. And I'll get off my soapbox now. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Carolyn, I'll go to you next.
I feel Adam might have wanted to respond to Elizabeth. Yes, Adam, or no?
Yeah, sure. I will. So I'm not going to respond on like specifics because I don't know the specifics. But what I do know is that that is something, Elizabeth, that the Colorado Clean Energy Fund is also very much looking into about how to create those bridges for incentives. And I don't know if Will has any more information on that than I do, but that's something that they want to really build out. I think both residentially and commercially. Build out kind of those bridge funding opportunities that essentially leverage that back end value of the credit up front, so that they don't have to be, you know, bearing those costs long term. And while I agree with you that I think the energy code, this doesn't necessarily isn't anything we can do with the energy code, and it's important for us to recognize as we are deciding what to do with the energy code. So I appreciate you bringing it up nonetheless.
Thanks. Good to hear. Can't wait.
Thanks, guys. All right, Carolyn, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And Elizabeth's comments also prompted me to name this in terms of affordability. So like syncing up with rebate opportunities, tax credit opportunities, et cetera. I think being really thoughtful around two things. One is the degree to which we can use simplified pathways to compliance that also align with eligibility under federal tax credits or others. So thinking about you know, some of the Energy Star pathways to favor that, because it's they're getting double bang for their buck by complying and getting a certification. And then also on the other side is being very thoughtful that when we loosen something, we're not unintentionally then making it ineligible for some of those. So making sure we're kind of ensuring we're syncing up our requirements and not setting people up to suddenly not benefit from what's out there.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I guess just kind of following up on that, thinking through how our team can support the board in some of those considerations. You know, there are a lot of utilities with a lot of programs and a lot of local governments with a lot of different programs. Is there a level that might be helpful, local government, state, utility, federal, that we could at least sort of support the board in understanding like what's out there at that level, without perhaps writing down every incentive across the state, which we could also do if needed, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know that you need to be exhaustive, but certainly I would look at kind of core federal tax credit state incentives. I mean, like there's a lot of aligning around certain criteria that across all of them. And so I think kind of hitting the big hitters, I think would be my advocacy.
And to Elizabeth's point earlier, Carolyn, also most of those federal tax credits are irrespective of whether it's a requirement or whether it was voluntary. Right? If you are an Energy Star Next Gen certified home, you get the credit whether or not it was required for you to be an Energy Star Next Gen certified home. So that I think there is a difference too between public tax credits, state and federal, and utility incentives in that regard.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, guys. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Kind of jump back to the concept of the upfront cost versus the long range ROI. I've seen a lot of reports over quite a few years, not just when the Energy Code Board, but other analysis when we've been taking the new Energy Code to my council. And I just, while we were talking, Googled up what's the average time frame that a person keeps a home that they purchased, and it's about 3 or 4 sites saying about 12.3 years. So the concept of thinking on your ROI for energy costs over 30 years, in my opinion, goes out the window, and because you don't even see the benefit of that unless you're one of the small minority that keep a home for 30 years and actually pay all that mortgage interest. But with that being said, you've also got that same concept on multifamily developers, because they have to pay that upfront cost. Everything that's going to be added, 2024 IECC is going to have to now require on-site renewable just as a base code requirement. And you put that into the mix for a developer when they figure out what they're going to need to get their money back, and setting the rates for what they're charging per month. So I think, in my opinion, the upfront costs have to be looked at much more than the long range ROI for the different components. I'm going to keep harping on that as we go through. So sorry to be a broken record.
Don't apologize, Tim. Thanks for that comment. I'll go to Kristen. Kristen, you're still muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I keep doing that. So the big question up at the top that you dropped in the chat and had on the slide was energy equity and affordability and indoor air quality. And I wanted to repeat a mantra that some of us use in the efficiency world, which is seal it tight, ventilate it right. If people are unfamiliar with that, what that essentially is pointing to is that over time, due to our energy codes, we're sealing our buildings up better and better. This does have a myriad of benefits that have been, we won't reopen that bag here, but it does impose some additional costs, right? And that means that we're doing all of this work to seal our buildings really tight, but then, they're so tight that we need to make sure that we manage the ventilation, that we can't just trust leaks in the building to ventilate it. So now we're sealing it all tight, but we're poking holes and then properly ventilating, ideally with an appropriate heat exchanger or recovery device. And that does impose some additional costs, and it does impose some additional energy burden. So I wanted to throw out one idea for the board to consider. That would be something we could potentially do or recommend that could have an immediate low-cost impact on air quality in buildings and help protect those buildings over their life. And this is due to a personal experience that I have had, and one that I know a lot of Coloradans had after several of the major fires that we've had. And that is that when manufacturers ship and HVAC professionals install these energy recovery ventilators or heat recovery ventilators that are increasingly being required by code, especially in residential buildings, they're often shipped with just your basic standard filter. And those basic filters are often not rated for smoke or getting out those fine particulates that can really exacerbate asthma or other indoor air quality problems. Now you might think, well, that's something that any individual building owner or occupant could deal with, because they're the ones that ultimately buy those filters. But the truth is, you actually need to calibrate that equipment at install for higher efficiency filters. So if if it's calibrated for a low efficiency filter, and then you retrofit or you put in a thicker filter, you could get some imbalance problems. So one thing that we could do that would be virtually no cost, or maybe a couple of bucks, is to specify at the outset when those are installed that they be calibrated for high efficiency filters so that people can have better indoor air quality in their buildings. So I wanted to throw that out as a tangible idea.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen.
If I could just comment just about that.
Please,
So one thing that you have to be careful of is if you just swap out the filters, you end up increasing the fan energy that's needed. So it's actually a better way to approach it is actually to put in a dedicated filter with a larger surface area so that you don't increase the static pressure. And then the HVAC system doesn't have to be recalibrated. You maintain the static pressure. That actually long term is a much less energy consumptive way to increase that filter capacity.
Thanks, Ron.
Yeah.
Ron, and I'm just making sure I understand this correctly because this will show up in our notes. That you're saying that there's like a permanent filter that would be put in?
So the issue is that if you just take out, if you just put in a more restrictive filter without increasing the surface area, you end up increasing the static pressure, which then takes more fan energy, and that's for the life of the device. So another alternative is to put in a dedicated filter box that has a larger surface area, so that you can get you can filter out things like wildfire smoke without actually having any energy penalty.
Okay.
And to point to why that's important, we do experience an increasing wildfire season here. And if you don't have a filter or capacity rated for wildfire smoke, then if you happen to have a wildfire, the manufacturer recommendation is to turn your ERV off. And these buildings need continuous ventilation. So there are some times in our state where that's just not feasible.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. That's great. Kim, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks. And I'll just chime in. Thanks, Ron, for adding to what Kristen was saying, because there is a requirement in code that ERVs operate at a certain CFM per watt. So if they don't test at that CFM per watt, even if they've been designed for that, then they don't meet the IECC requirements. So super helpful to have that detail. But I was just going to chime in kind of a transition from Kristen talking about indoor air quality to outdoor air quality, and kind of why we're looking at building energy codes at all, is that there's a cost that's not included in all of our cost analysis, and that's the cost of carbon on people's health, on our environment, greenhouse gas emissions. We all know that. I'm not going to go on a soapbox about it, but we don't have a carbon tax. There's nothing in our society economically that includes the cost of carbon on people's health and upon our world in how we're analyzing the impacts on our buildings and construction costs. And I just kind of wanted to bring that up. It was one of the items that Kim had in her first questions there for us to consider. And I think it's a really important aspect for us to remember as we go through this. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim, for bringing that up. Absolutely. Will, I'll pass it to you.
I wanted to weigh in a little bit on this question of how do we think about affordability and how do we think about first cost versus ongoing costs. And in my mind, both are important. And up until pretty recently, since we'd had a period of pretty stable interest rates, the way that I was thinking about it is that you would look at essentially taking any incremental upfront cost, looking at if you finance that over a typical 30-year mortgage, what is the annual payments required? How does that compare to the annual savings? Not that you would have a simple, you're only going to do this if annual savings are greater than annual costs, but you would at least be able to have a meaningful comparison, I think, between the upfront costs and ongoing operating savings. It feels like we're now in a world where there's just great uncertainty going forward, what interest rates are going to look like. We've had this surge. Presumably it's going to go back down. We don't know the timing or at what point it's going to come back down. So that strikes me as just another factor that makes it difficult to do that type of a comparison. Overall, I think, fundamentally we're going to be making some qualitative comparisons more than quantitative, given that there's just so much uncertainty. There's that uncertainty in interest rates. There's the uncertainty that Rob talked about sort of what are the true upfront costs. There's the fact that we don't really know what energy costs are going to be in the future. I think we probably have a pretty good idea on electricity, since electricity costs, once you take out inflation, have been pretty stable over time and are likely to be relatively stable into the future. But we've seen such wild fluctuations in the cost of natural gas, and we have that large uncertainty about whether we are going to see a ramp down in natural gas use that will cause fixed costs of the gas system to be imposed over a smaller and smaller base of gas use, and the potential of really significant cost increases there. So in my mind, it's going to be important to look at the cost issues in a number of different ways and from a number of different perspectives, and that we likely end up with a pretty broad range of estimates of both upfront costs and ongoing costs or ongoing cost savings. So I just think that it's important that we not end up with sort of false precision in our analysis of affordability. The other piece that I think is going to be important as we think about affordability is this notion, at least on the residential side, if we go in a direction where we are looking at perhaps different standards based upon house size, in my mind, the affordability questions are very different, for very large homes. So if you have a 5,000 square foot home where cost increases mean that, boy, you're going to need to reduce that by a couple percent and you're going to end up at 4,900 square feet, that's probably not a real problem from an affordability perspective. Whereas the first costs that might be imposed on, much smaller homes that are much more likely to be people who are on the verge of not being able to afford homeownership, I think we should look at those very differently. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Thanks, Will. That's a really great comprehensive sort of approach to thinking about cost. And I know as Adam and I start to engage with some technical consultants on these cost evaluation opportunities as we move through, we can certainly think about how to include those different perspectives that you mentioned. I think, Will, that was a really nice segue into the last session we wanted to chat through, and I just want to make sure we save some time for it, which is that one size fits all regional applicability approach, and making sure that again we're considering the wide variety of homes and communities across the state as we're developing the code. So some questions for the board to consider, and we'll probably chat about this for 10-12 minutes and then we'll need to wrap up for the day. But how can we develop a code that strikes a balance between accommodating regional and geographic diversity and a broad stroke applicability and replication across the state? Where do you all see the biggest differences in needs across the state? For example, where might a code that suits Telluride conflict with a code that suits a community in the Eastern Plains? And do we believe that these differences are already addressed in the code through climate zone differences in climate zone requirements, or is there additional steps we want to take? Can the appendices be leveraged to address this concern around a regional applicability? Which requirements or sections of the code do we see these regional challenges show up? And then I added that last bullet, which is why it's not a complete sentence, as I heard it earlier, thinking about home size variance and how that might impact sort of the regional needs across the state. So again, I will copy these and put them into the chat for folks to consider, but welcome any board members to jump in with their thoughts. Elizabeth, and then we'll go to Kristen and Carolyn.
Yeah, I think a big obvious one that probably doesn't even need stating, but I'll state it anyways, is resources available. And I kind of mean like professional and labor resources in particular. Like there's some code requirements around testing, for example, like blower door testing, commissioning, and things where some of our more remote areas don't have as many resources as we do in, say, the Denver metro area. And I do think that should be kept in mind because some of those things are not necessarily local. Like if you've got to ship in a commissioning person from, Denver to Telluride, that definitely adds costs and delays and things like that should be considered.
Thanks, Carolyn. Absolutely. Or sorry, Elizabeth. I was looking at Carolyn's box when I said that. Carolyn.
Yeah, building on that, similarly, I think we need to recognize that the enforcement agencies will vary in terms of their capacity to track requirements and so to the degree that we're imposing a lot of complexity in terms of inspection and enforcement, I think we should be cognizant of that. I've named this before, but we'll say it here as well. The solar requirements are going to be vastly different in areas of the state where you're served by regulated investor-owned utility versus a co-op versus a muni versus other types of support. And then I don't have a solution for this yet, but I did note the public comment we got about roof pitch and solar from our existing code in communities with high snow volumes. So it was a specific reference to, I believe, steamboat and that hazard that sliding snow off of a solar array can result in. That's unique, I think somewhat unique to mountain communities in terms of snow volumes, but just wanted to name that as one we should think about as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Carolyn. These are great. Kim.
I just wanted to chime in on what Elizabeth said. We definitely have an extreme shortage of workforce across the entire energy industry across the state. I think that's even an issue as codes ramp up and more electrification happens in metropolitan areas and not just out here. But personally, I believe and would hope that instead of scaling back requirements for the code across the state, that instead we leverage and work with the Colorado Energy Office and other resources to increase the workforce available to serve the code needs. That's one thing that we are focusing on highly in our area and with other nonprofits and organizations that I work with Energy Smart Colorado network across the state. We're all very focused on trying to increase that workforce and just are working on trying to find the resources from trainers to funding and the people interested in being trained to help make that happen. So just wanted to chime in that hopefully that can be the focus of trying to make the code a success. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, absolutely. Tim.
Yeah, thanks. And coming from a jurisdiction, Broomfield, we've got a lot of construction activity ongoing and in the future, which is great. No complaints. From a staffing standpoint, I've got 4 plans analysts and me, and we do everything internal. And as I've seen the IECC specifically over the years, from the 15 to the 18, 21, and now to the 24, the complexity of the base code requirements is getting to a point where you almost need to be, I don't know if there is such a thing with the state of Colorado, an energy engineer and get a stamp there, but I know they don't have that. But we need to pay attention across, and I'm a pretty good sized jurisdiction versus a lot of the smaller jurisdictions getting out into the rural. And my thought is, if we make this, more complicated, what we've seen is building departments, they may have to adopt it, but they'll just ignore it. And so keeping that in mind, that's why a lot of jurisdictions haven't even gone forward from the 15. So those are just my comments from a resource standpoint from a jurisdiction. I remember when I took the Broomfield Electric Ready and Solar Ready Code to my council last fall, two of the comments from my council were, do you have to add any staff? And that was one of their criteria, not necessarily is it the right thing to be doing from the energy code. It was our staffing level. And at that point, I felt comfortable that we could handle that in-house. I might be talking, we don't have the luxury of having a whole separate energy sustainability group doing inspections like some groups. I think, Boulder County, Boulder, couple of them do, the bigger jurisdictions. So those are my comments from my own perspective.
Thanks, Tim, and really important to keep those in mind as there's a lot smaller communities than Broomfield out there as well. Kristen, and then we'll go to Rob. Kristen, you're muted.
Oh, so
We'll get there.
a lot of you know, I am on the western slope in the high Rockies and have recently gone through the building process. So everything people have said about the lack of resources resonates. A few specific examples. I am not sure anybody in our county until recently has really been doing blower door tests. It's hard to find someone to come up and do that. It's hard to find people that know how to size or install energy recovery ventilators, for example, in some of these places. So something we want to be mindful of, and just a plea to the state to help those rural areas increase capacity, or maybe even incentivize additional people to get trained in HERS rating and whatnot in this state. It's hard to even find available slots to get that kind of training. So thanks. I know the state has been doing a lot on that. I wanted to echo the need for that, continued need for that. And as Tim was saying, you know, if locals don't feel supported, or if things move fast, you may find that building inspectors just don't look at certain elements of the code. And we certainly found that when we were going through the code inspection process. So it is something to be mindful of. That being said, I think there is a tendency in our state to really emphasize the differences, whereas maybe we can look at some of the commonalities. And I think one of the best common approaches that works, that has been brought up here, is the size approach. It doesn't matter if you're in the high Rockies, and you know, the Eastern Plains, or in the Front Range. There are going to be differences, and accommodating perhaps some of the smaller building size or the ADU size, and applying a common but differentiated responsibility for those larger buildings is going to address, I think, a lot of the affordability issues.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. Rob?
Yeah. So, you know, I think just to you know, the risk of piling on, you know, that kind of goes, what we're speaking about goes to my earlier point of enforceability and applicability, making sure that it's actually an enforceable code. I just want to tell a quick anecdote from our service territory in Minnesota. We heard a story yesterday of a building code official had their job threatened for trying to enforce the energy code. And we have a state energy code that's been in effect for 10 years in Minnesota. And so, you know, there's a so I think that's something to keep in mind too, of just it's an anecdote I think it could be applicable here. And you know, the reason I stepped away is because I wanted to ask somebody about the social cost of carbon in our DSM program. We do have a social cost of carbon that we roll into our cost benefit analyses, and it's $50 to $70 per ton of CO2, depending on the year of emission. And that figure comes from a federal technical working group. So there is a social cost of carbon. We do use that social cost of carbon in some of our energy efficiency program cost benefit analyses. So there are resources out there that are in effect for social cost of carbon.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Great. So I think we'll go Kim, and then I'll just ask that if any board members have any final comments or thoughts on this topic, that you raise your hands now. We'll try to get through the last few comments before we wrap up today. So Kim, over to you.
I just wanted to chime in on what some of the building departments are doing to try to address the increased inspection requirements, et cetera. And that kind of goes along with the scaling of size of homes, that the larger homes have more requirements. They need to use less energy per square foot. And that third-party inspectors, such as HERS raters, and not to tout my industry at all, but are being relied upon by the building departments to perform those inspections, so that it decreases the extra that is required by building departments and decreases that need for extra staff. Again, this gets into the workforce shortage that we have across the state for HERS raters and other third-party inspectors. But I think that is, again, a way to address it without having all these requirements for the code be on the building departments themselves. And it helps diversify that experience, because most building departments don't have energy expertise. So that's just one way to address it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kim, for sharing that perspective. That's great. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo what a lot of people have said here, but I do fear that the jump between where some jurisdictions are now, 2015 IECC plus, maybe a little fluff in there, and that, they're then required to jump to, whatever this new code is, that they just won't do it. I mean, yeah, I know they're going to be mandated, but there, is it going to be so much or too far that they throw their hands up and say, oh, yeah, well, we can't possibly, we're going to enforce the code, but we're not really going to enforce the code. That to me seems like the worst sin, honestly, than trying to empathize with them, and maybe there's a way to provide some stepping stones into some of the things that are seen as maybe most onerous, most challenging, between where they are now and where we'd like to get them to be. And I don't know exactly what that looks like or how that could be built into the code, but if we can identify what those are, maybe it can be, all right, if you're coming from the 2015 IECC, say, here's what you're going to do the first year, here's what you're going to do the second year, here's what you do the third year, to kind of step them up into where we'd like them to be in a way that's also very supported. So we're not just throwing this huge giant challenge that they don't have the ability to deal with or the resources to deal with. So I don't know, stepping stones, maybe somehow.
Okay. Yeah, we can consider and ponder how that might show up. Kim.
Just on that topic of stepping stones, in addition to workforce development and training, building code official and building code industry code training is obviously going to be necessary as well, and something that is applicable statewide. People don't have to travel to Denver, something that the trainers can come across. I know we incorporated that. We just submitted to the CEO for a large grant to have a code cohort here in our region across 3 counties, and incorporated workforce training and building official and building industry training into that code cohort grant request. So again, just another plea to the CEO to continue to support those efforts, because I think that's definitely going to be needed. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, Adam and Rob, you will be our last 2 commenters, because I do want to wrap us up on time today. So I ask that you keep your comments brief, but Adam, go for it.
I don't really need to say much other than we have a ton of resources at the Energy Office, and I will be quite frank that they are not utilized to the level that they could be. And we try to do a lot of outreach, and we try to do a lot of engagement, and we try to provide, support and technical assistance and all these types of opportunities. And so I think just one thing that we need to be aware of is the other barriers of like getting folks to be willing to use the resources that exist, because everything that you've talked about, Elizabeth, Kim, Kristen, like everything, all of you have talked about are resources that we have to fund. So I think the challenge here is getting folks to take advantage of them, and we are always open to different perspectives or different information or recommendations on how we can do that better, because we have those resources, we want them to be utilized. So that's a conversation for another day. But
okay, and maybe we can try to define what those hurdles are, like why aren't they being used?
Awesome. And then Rob, yeah, feel free to jump in.
Sorry. So this is probably a quick question. This is probably a quick question for Tim. On to the point of, adopting but maybe not enforcing the code. Are there any consequences for a code official that maybe doesn't necessarily enforce the code? Because I think there are some jurisdictions where, like, for example, in New Mexico, the state code official can throw out the local code official who doesn't enforce the code. But I don't know if we got that kind of, it's certainly beyond our, I think our circle of influence. But I'd like to, that's my question. Are there any consequences for failing to enforce?
Before you answer, Tim, maybe I'm not very comfortable with this conversation. Am I alone? I don't want to have that conversation about, I think that's outside of our board's kind of purview right now. And I don't want to speculate on what local jurisdictions do or don't do, even though I appreciate the spirit of the comment, which is that we don't want to make it so hard, challenging or complex that they're not going to be successful in enforcing it.
Yeah, I think that, like, we want to set this up for success, I think
Right.
is the goal there.
The,
I agree.
The spirit as opposed, yeah.
Yes.
The spirit of it, thank you.
Yes. Set it up for success, not failure.
Okay. Well, Rob, thoughtful question. If others folks want to follow up with Rob offline and share some thoughts, feel free.
No, that feedback is well received. I understand.
Awesome. Okay. Great. Well, I am going to first thank you guys for the engaging discussion today. I think a lot of really great ideas and things for us to consider and keep in mind as we move through these discussions were shared. So I just really appreciate you guys engaging today. So I want to just talk about a couple of next steps. You all were sent a code survey late last night, and generally there will be. This is one of 3. So we sent you the commercial survey. There will be a residential one, and there will be one on the model code. Generally, the format of the survey is pretty straightforward. We go through each section of the code, each sort of high-level topic within the sections of the code, and ask at a high level, do you want to touch this part of the code? Do you want to try to strengthen this part of the code? Or do you want to try to weaken this part of the code? And then there's, of course, opportunities for open-ended responses and more detailed descriptions as you're working through it. There's a lot of instruction and sort of direction in that email, but I think I want to emphasize to you all that this is the results of this survey are going to be what drive our focused agendas for the meetings that we have to discuss the code elements. We have 5 meetings to discuss residential and 5 meetings to discuss commercial. We're starting with commercial, which is why you got that code first, or that survey first. But with only 5 meetings, we are going to have to be super focused on the areas of the code that the board wants to touch and play with. So in that, I ask that you be really thoughtful as you're reviewing, and if there are smaller nuanced changes you'd like to make, certainly note those. But there's a question at the end of the survey that asks you to prioritize what you would like the board to discuss as we move into those code discussions. And so yeah, we just really hope that you'll take the time to do that survey and complete it well. Kellen, I'm going to get through one more slide, and then hopefully if you have a question, I'm answering it. So in light of that being a very long survey, and you may have seen in my email that we expect it will take a couple of hours for you all to complete the survey, there is a way for you all to save progress. And so I just want to make sure that everyone is aware on how to save progress as you move through the survey so that you don't lose any work if you have to pause and come back. So I'll demonstrate this, but the sort of the 3 rules of thumb are to make sure you're using the same browser when taking the survey. So don't flip from Safari to Chrome or back. You have to complete a full page and click next in order for your information to be saved. And there's pretty much like 1 topic per page. So we're not going to ask you to go through all of chapter 4 in the code and then click save, but you'll have regular opportunities to save as you move through. And then when you reopen the survey, your progress will be saved and you can continue. So I just wanted to show you guys that this works in case there are any confusions or concerns that this might not work. So here we've got, I started my survey, right? So this is just what it looks like. I said, this topic doesn't need to be changed. No, so I'm not suggesting any comments, and I'm going to click next. I also filled out this topic, so this code should be weakened. I'm going to click next. Let's say I'm going to just be strengthened, and I'll just throw some things in there and click next. Okay, so I've gone through 3 pages. I'm now very busy and I must go. So I'm going to X out of that Survey Monkey. I have got the link saved on my computer, so I'm going to open it back up. Now I'm back on my computer. I'm ready to dive back in. And where does it open me? Right where I left off in the survey. Now, if I go to the previous one, there's my weird entry. It's still there. Same with the one before. Same with the one before. So as long as you fill this in and click next, your entry will be saved the next time you jump into the survey to complete it. So that's the big thing I wanted to share. Make sure you guys all feel really comfortable with that. If you have any issues, let us know. We should be able to, like, if for some reason you lose all your entries on the back end, there should be something we can do to find your entries. So just keep us posted. And so I guess with that, I realize we're a couple minutes over. So I will just quickly say, and then I will stay on to answer questions. Board meeting, June 27th. It's 2 hours, and we're going to use the results of the survey to finalize and discuss how we're going to move through our commercial discussions. As a reminder, there's a study session for you all next, I believe it's Tuesday from 12 to 1. Next Tuesday from 12 to 1. It's an hour long, and this is a session where we'll have Hope and Anna available to answer any questions you guys might have on the IECC. And then again, remember the code survey. So I guess the one thing I wanted to ask, if folks need that study session, if not, we won't waste everyone's time with it. But if folks feel like they need it or want us to keep it, if you guys just don't mind sending me or Adam a quick email after this meeting, just like, hey, I would love to be there. I'm planning to be there. That would be really helpful. So we make sure we keep that meeting if we need it. Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple of questions and then we'll wrap up for the day. So Carolyn and then Andrew.
Yeah, so thanks, Kim. I had a question on the survey. We just went through the whole discussion about how to debias the code, which I think is neither strengthening nor weakening. And so I was curious about things that were, under the category of, I think this needs to be clarified, simplified, modified, but is neither strengthening or weakening. I can use any box. I just want to make sure that the way you're accounting for it on the back end, that doesn't create an issue with, since we don't have a more neutral comment option.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. That's a really fantastic point. Adam, any initial thoughts? I mean, I don't know what I think. What do you think, Adam?
Well, I think, Carolyn, so this survey doesn't require you to select one of those things, like changed, doesn't need to be changed, strengthened, or weakened. I think in order to move forward, that's right, Kim, right? Like you don't have to select that. So I guess if there's something that you want to change that is none of those three, you could just not select one, and then I would say just put your comments somewhere in one of those two boxes about like I want a neutral amendment. I want it to be changed, but it's not strengthening or weakening, and here's what it is.
I think that would work, and I apologize that that's a little wonky. I think that was something that's a good flag, Carolyn. So I like Adam's approach. If it's just sort of a simplified, mild modified, not strengthening or weakening, feel free to just include in one of the boxes your comment. And if that top part isn't filled in, that can be an indicator. But we'll be combing pretty deeply through this data, so we hope we'll catch all of those items when you drop them in the comment boxes.
And I would note too that there's a high chance that you could have a neutral amendment and a strengthening amendment in one of these sections. And so if there is something that's strengthening, I would still select strengthening and just note in your comments that like this one amendment I'm suggesting is not strengthening or weakening, just so that we are aware of that when we look at the results.
And while we're still building the residential and model code surveys, we'll add that as a fourth option element. So it's a little bit cleaner for that survey.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. Andrew, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, my comment was similar to what you just discussed. So you will add a fourth option because there should be an other.
Yeah.
So Adam, the thing is we could make that adjustment to the survey and get the link back out to folks tomorrow. I don't think it would take long to add that extra option if that would help with folks as they're moving through this. The survey link won't change. So you'll just see that it's modified as long as that doesn't hamper anyone, or I don't think anyone started the survey at 10 p.m. last night. So we could make that adjustment, Adam, if we want.
I agree, that would be
fine.
helpful.
Yeah, let's just do that. We'll just change it
Okay.
for this one, and then we'll make sure the others have it as well, the future ones.
Wonderful. So we'll just have a sort of a fourth option. We want to modify this for no particular reason, and then we'll have that third comment box for that. Okay, thank you guys. So with that, again, we will ask that you complete the survey by Friday, June 21st. That will just give us a few days to make sure got all the data, we're downloading it, we're organizing it, and we're prepping for that meeting on the 27th. And again, a reminder, if you do want that study session and you're looking forward to it next week, to please just let us know. We'll update the survey as soon as possible and get it back to folks. I would assume it will happen sort of before noon tomorrow, just given that I know our person with the Survey Monkey is tied up in meetings all day. So we'll get that to you guys as soon as possible, and we'll shoot an email to the board when it's ready. And with that, happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. So we'll keep the study session because Tim sounds like he'll be there. But have a great Tuesday, and we'll talk to you guys next week. And thanks again, as always, for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.